and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And I remind you that it's Hromadske International, and the Sunday show is on air. From November 30th to December the 1st, experts from around the world gathered in Ukraine to discuss global security issues at the Lviv Security Forum. This was the forum's first year. It joins the well-populated landscape of regional forums dedicated to questions of Eastern European and global security and international relations. We are joined in the studio by Oksana Syroyid, Deputy Chair of the Ukrainian Parliament and one of the organizers of the Security Conference. In fact, she is credited by some experts with the very idea of holding the forum. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting.
Why was it necessary to hold the forum in Lviv? After all, we have at least 3 forums that I can remember now at the spot in Kiev.
That's true. The idea of security forums, security conferences and discussions is very popular around the world, especially in Europe and especially in Eastern Europe. And I've been the member of the number of them. And they're just, because of my observation from those numerous discussions, it was an idea that actually we have kind of deep into the nature of the problems, because in the majority of the panels that exist, there are very prominent speakers. However, unfortunately, very often, maybe organizers, maybe speakers don't dare to go inside into the nature of what is happening.
What was so daring at the Lviv Security Forum as compared to the previous ones?
I was really worried whether it will work out, whether this will take off, you know. And I was very happy because all the speakers and the moderators, they probably, as I did, yeah, they realized the need for this discussion. And we had fantastic panels on the legacy that actually provoked current situation, that made Russia such aggressive, the legacy after the First World War, after the Second World War, after the Cold War. The next panel was devoted to the big extent to the fact of the war and the military conduct, to the hybrid status of the war. Then we've been discussing in the depths the sanctions, whether they work or don't work, the Minsk, whether it works or not work.
What's your conclusion?
And
do they or not? Do they work?
What I liked about the forum, that it was very honest, and some of the, for example, some of the panelists, they openly were mentioning that unfortunately the current negotiation on Minsk, this is the road to disaster. Because it substituted international legal and security order, and it substituted especially for Ukraine. And Ukraine is the most vulnerable in this situation. And those were not even Ukrainian panelists who were mentioning this. And when it came to the panel on who will pay for this, who will be accountable, there are very, very good remarks that unfortunately the hybrid war is in such a nature that it's very difficult to identify when it will be over, what will end, that will be the end up of the war. And actually we all agreed that such a discussion is a great value for all of those participants and maybe the broader scope of people. And of course there will be maybe another topics, maybe some of them will be discussed in the more details, maybe some other will be added. So we decided to continue.
Speaking of hybrid war, I was frankly amazed at reading one of the articles about the Security Forum, Lviv Security Forum, which maintained that the Lviv Security Forum is in itself an element of the hybrid war against Ukraine, as it moves attention away from Kiev to Lviv, and because it is organized by, it was supposedly organized by Andriy Sadovy, who is the mayor of Lviv and one of the leaders of the opposition Samopomich party, to which you incidentally belong. So how do you feel? Maybe you were played by some people who really wanted to sow discontent among Ukrainians by creating another center in Ukraine.
There's nothing to do about the center. The idea belonged to the group of people and to me personally for a long time. They said we were delivering this idea for 2 years at least, and we've been discussing with different people. And when we were thinking about the hosting place or the hosting city for this event, well, you understand that the willingness to be honest in the discussion doesn't mean in Ukraine very often the open gates, you know? Very often, wherever you try to organize something and to have open discussion, the doors get closed. And here Lviv probably was the natural place because as you mentioned, the mayor of Lviv, he is open to this discussion, and Lviv is famous for a number of forums of different categories. So that's why it was the decision. It was kind of the natural decision. I never even thought why it was decided to be in Lviv, because it was kind of natural. But we have Yalta economic strategy in Arsenal. Does anybody claim it's separatism?
In Arsenal in Kiev.
in Arsenal in Kiev.
Not everybody knows, yeah.
And nobody claims it's separatism. What's wrong?
Well, I don't know, but actually you were among the people who were openly accused of separatism by the governor of Lviv Oblast or Lviv region, and all this for just having a map that someone did not like on the background of the discussion. Briefly about and from my point of view, excuse me, Ms. Syroyid, but you are often characterized as one of the leaders of the party of war, or those who say no to any separatism. Why? Where did you go wrong? Where did you slip that you gave
I don't think that it was any wrongdoings. It was not a map, it was infographics that showed and it was called like this, and it was shown like this. It showed the places in Europe where Russia positioned its military forces. So, and inside of Ukraine, there were 2 territories, and as well as in Georgia and Transnistria in Moldova, and they were called the way they are. Where Russia put their forces. Russia put their forces in the DNR and LNR. And they were mentioned like this. This is because Russia put their forces to those particular proxies, so-called proxy republic. But this is, by the way, I think that this discussion now is very good, because unfortunately we are all trapped now by uncertainty. You know that I've been demanding for 2 years to call those territories occupied. Then they would have legal status, and nobody would call them so-called DNR, LNR, proxy republics, whatsoever. They would have this common legal status, occupied territories of
just
Eastern
as
Ukraine.
Crimea.
Yeah, and unfortunately it was not done. And now everybody uses the term each of them wants. And this is one problem. The second problem, I'm very sorry, but under the Minsk agreements that are blessed by the president, by the Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande, there are signatures of the leaders of those so-called people republics. It was not Oksana Syroyid who blessed them, actually. It was not me. But and this is also the issue. We have to be accountable. Somebody has to be accountable for legitimizing all this.
Thank you very much, Ms. Syroyid, for joining us.
Thank you.
And Hromadske's Tatyana Ogarkova was at the Security Forum and attended a panel discussion with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, Commandant General of the United States Army Europe. He spoke about the potential of a peacekeeping mission in Donbass and what he believes it would have to look like to be effective. Let's take a look.
Peacekeeping forces are being discussed. I think there's merit in that. But, number one, whatever the agreement is, should not allow Russia to freeze in place what it has achieved. So that would be very important. Number two, the quality of the peacekeeping force would need to be very high. From countries, from militaries that have real capability and that everybody would respect. And the mandate would need to be something that would allow them to actually enforce. If you remember in Bosnia, after the Dayton Peace Accord, or before the Dayton Peace Accord, you had a UN protection force with lots of brave men and women from several countries, but their mandate was very weak and they did not have the correct rules of engagement. And so you ended up with soldiers handcuffed to light posts and their boots stolen from them by Serbs. NATO and the Dayton Peace Accords created the I-4 implementation force, and they had real rules of engagement and a real chain of command that allowed them to shoot anybody that violated. So significant difference. So whatever agreement is made cannot freeze in place what I believe, this is Hodges, should not freeze in place what Russia wants to keep in place. Should come from countries that have real professional, competent forces, and the rules of engagement, the mandate, should be something that is effective. Russia for 400 years has never lived up to any agreement they've ever signed unless there was a very strong verification and monitoring capability. The OSCE, a very respected organization, is not allowed to do its job in the Donbass because the Russians and the Russian-led separatists keep them away, threaten them, shoot at them. And of course, there's nobody monitoring the border between Donbass and Russia. So that's an example of courageous men and women trying to do a job, but the Russians show no respect for them. Now, are we winning? I think that if Ukraine does not follow through with the reforms that it said it would do, then we're not winning. I mean, that's obviously President Putin, the Russian Federation, would love to see no reform, oligarchs in charge of everything. And candidly, I think the rest, Europe and the West, will grow tired if we don't see legitimate reform happening inside Ukraine. So are we winning, are we losing? Ukrainian soldiers stop Russian soldiers, you stop the Russians. But what really matters is the strategic effect, the outcome that we all want. And key to that is going to be follow through on the reform. Then we could see, are we winning or losing?
Well, General Hodges was not the only person who attracted Hromadske's Tatyana Ogarkova's attention at the Lviv Security Forum. She also spoke in detail to Sven Sakov, director of the International Center for Defense and Security, situated in Estonia, one of the smallest NATO members. Let's see what Mr. Sakov had to say.
I have and am and I will criticize the sloppy use of a term without actually people realizing, understanding what it means, and the historical background of that. What we can put together, like under the terms like maskirovka and everything else. And why the sloppy use of this term would be detrimental is because I think this is also taking focus away from actually a very important aspect of what is called hybrid warfare, which is actually a kinetic force, military force, or the threat of using military force. When we saw events happening when actually Russian aggression against Ukraine started in February 2014, the annexation, occupation of Crimea and so forth, that was preceded by a Russian kind of snap exercise and a very credible big conventional threat on the other side of the border. And there's nothing hybrid of having, divisions lined up. This is very clear thing. This is not to say that we should not be dealing with all the other aspects of let's say, what is called hybrid warfare, which is much better to be called like George Kennan did in his lecture series at the NATO, sorry, not NATO, but the United States Army War College in 1946-47. He called that Russian measures short to war, meaning that one is kind of you have a gamut of state power at your disposal, what you use, and then basically, if necessary, you introduce the armed forces to back it up. And I would say this is nothing extraordinary in it. There's nothing extraordinary that a country X is using all the different leverages it has in order to influence country Z. I mean, it has happened all the time. Using a economic power, it's using the energy as a weapon, it's using information as a weapon. It is they're trying to corrupt, subvert, and so forth. This has happened probably from the start of a warfare between tribes. The same issues. Technology had been different, the scale has been different, but I would say this is still the same thing. And why I think it's important to not to lose focus from a kinetic force, or basically the use of force, defense effort. I'll illustrate it. In 2014, after Crimea and Donetsk, Estonian Chief of Defense, General Teros, was asked by one Western European journalist, so what are you going to do if little green men will pop up in Narva, Estonian border town to Russia? And General Teros answered without any hesitation, we will shoot them dead. Do you have more questions? The journalist was so shocked that actually one is contemplating using force in the defense of the constitution and order of a country, that journalist was basically out of questions because he did not expect that. So I think we should be really not losing sight of it. And that does not mean that all the other aspects of it, because basically the leverages of state power are not important. They are. We should be defending ourselves in cyberspace. We should be defending ourselves in information warfare space. Because, I mean, if we talk about the latter, then, what is the aim of the information warfare? Its aim is to change the thinking on the other side, calculations on the other side, and so forth. In democratic nations, it is very often of course, you don't need to directly influence the politicians, you influence the electoral base. And I think this is basically, when we look at that, and look at the efforts by the other side on influencing our democratic systems, look at the Russian interference in the American elections in 2016, I think this is, I mean, we're talking about the core of what we are, core of what democratic nations, Estonia or Ukraine or France are, and how the decisions are made in that democratic process. And I think this is a very grave thing, and we have to be very meticulous in trying to address that.